or from Lance Armstrong's advantageous relationship with the who's who in sports journalism, who believed in his innocence for years and were avid defenders of the now disgraced 7-time World Tour de France cycling champion, to Mac Maharaj's defense of President Jacob Zuma's Brett Murray painting, which showed the president's unmentionables. Fenweek journalist Bruce Whitfield joins us to look at the art and science that the best PR specialists have demonstrated over the years amongst the best and worst PR campaigns. Joining me at the desk, Bruce Whitfield, Garth Tiernason, Fenweek journalist, and Lebo Madiba, founder and MD of PR Powerhouse. So I don't know how fair this is going to be, because we've got 3 journalists versus 1 PR, and we know that the relationship, how that goes.
It's perfectly fair, because, and I don't have the exact statistics, but I'm almost willing to bet that there are twice as many people working in the world of spin, public relations, and investor relations, if you like, in Joburg alone than there are journalists. I think this is a perfectly fair ratio.
I need protection.
I've actually got the stat. I read something in The Economist. In the US, for every 1 reporter that's employed, there's 6 PR personnel.
That sounds fair. I think this is perfectly fair, in other words.
It shows you how much money is invested in managing and massaging information.
Okay, well, there we go. Lebo, welcome to the show. We'll give you your fair time to speak and, of course, comment. But Bruce, you wrote Sultans of Sin. And
Sultans of Spin.
Sultan of Spin. Let's not get that wrong.
Although I think Sultans of Sin is possibly a better headline.
We missed a beat there.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Mac Maharaj makes the front cover this time around. Tell us about what the reason behind the story.
Okay. This story, the genesis of this story goes back about 5 years, when Garth over here said to me, you know, we really need to do a story about the spin industry. I said to him, oh, please, we're too busy doing real news. And then over the last couple of years, with Garth's voice in the back of my head, I've become increasingly aware of the amount of information that we are fed on a daily basis, the amount of information we are spun on a daily basis. And in Davos, just recently, from where CNBC was being broadcast, there was a report from one of the world's biggest PR companies which said that public faith in in institutions such as politicians, such as big business, and even media is at an all-time low. And I thought this is the great opportunity to finally write this story and say, why is it that public faith in ourselves as media, as in public faith in politicians and public faith in business, why is that the case? Bottom line is, because nobody knows what's true anymore, because there are so many people who are paid an incredible amount of money to give a particular version of the truth. The story starts off by lying, the best spin doctors never lie, and the best spin doctors will never lie. They'll tell you that much of the truth that they would like.
They'll leave out information.
They will omit to 1 or 2 inconsequential details that might enhance the reputation of their client, who pays them a lot of money to do that job for them.
How would you describe what it is that you do and are paid to do by your clients?
I think the reality of it is that it's all about reputation management. If you look at listed companies, you have a certain reputation that you need to maintain as a company, and what we do is to just work around the architecture of how we portray this business in the media. So he might want to attack it, but my role is to make sure that my client is protected, that my client says the right things, that the messaging that my client wants to put across is the right one that portrays them as a good citizen.
Okay, so here is the first point of contention, because he might want to attack it. Absolutely not. We don't attack. We simply look for truth. Absolutely, because we're innocent in this particular process, and the spin doctor industry admits to giving only one particular portion of that particular truth. It was Bernstein and Woodward and Bernstein, the guys who broke the Watergate story in 1973 or thereabouts, the story, you wouldn't remember it, Sam, but the one that brought down President Richard Nixon, the whole Watergate scandal. Bernstein...
I've read about it.
You have, yeah, in the history books included.
I've heard about it, yeah.
Bernstein and Woodward talk about journalists, and you are never going to get to the absolute truth. So as a journalist, your duty is to get the best obtainable version of the truth. And in that process, one comes up against people like Lebo, who act as the gatekeepers. One comes up against supremely well-trained and well-schooled chief executives. You come up against this all the time. And I can almost tell with certainty who the PR agency is without knowing, by listening to the sort of answers that are often delivered by chief executives, because they are schooled and trained in a certain way. There is a certain PR stamp on things that are said. And that is why, as journalists, our job is to cut through the muck that surrounds so much information that we are spread. Then we're accused of attacking. I think it's very unfair.
Yeah, I mean, I just remember going to one of the results interviews, and the CEO talked to the PR guy and said, has she seen your propaganda or our propaganda yet? And then you start the interview almost wanting to try and find what they haven't said, because you immediately start on the offensive in a sense, because you don't trust everything you've just read.
And you must never trust anything you hear or anything you are told, Sam. Rule number one.
Ultimately, does lying ever pay in this game?
Lying doesn't pay.
But it's used.
But it's used. It doesn't pay, but it's used. Like I said earlier,
how is it used? Explain to us. Give us an example if you can, or how is it used above board, in an above board way?
Lying in an above board way.
I'm not sure you can do that.
Yeah.
Well, lying in an above board way means that you know what the client has an image that they want to portray. So in everything and in every message of communication, you make sure that you portray that image, even if it means that some areas of the truth are not revealed. But you put out as much of the truth.
How do you sleep at night, Lebo?
It's as much of the truth as you can put across, Bruce. Yeah.
And you omit certain things. I mean, guys, you've been a journalist for many years. Tell us about your experience in this space and your experience with dealing with PR agents and the best type of communication. Should it be honest? And when you sniff out when they're being dishonest?
Look, I've certainly run into a whole heap of PR misdemeanors in my time. I'm not sure it's the forum to go through each one, but suffice it to say that there are good PRs and there are bad PRs, just like there are probably good journalists and bad journalists. I think that the risk is if you're trying to pull the wool over journalists' eyes, journalists, by the nature of their profession, will on a daily basis, you just have a nose for picking up when someone is trying to scam you and when they're not. And if you associate a certain person with continual lies or continual misinformation, you will eventually grow to distrust that person and you'll grow to distrust their clients as well. So to me, that's an example of bad PR. I think the best PRs are people who acknowledge the fact that they're doing a job. And their job is to, as Lebo pointed out, to make sure the right version of the truth is purveyed.
The best possible, the most palatable version of events.
Can I tell you what works? Go ahead.
We are looking forward to that.
Just to continue there, if you know that the person you're dealing with, if the person acknowledges that that is their role, you immediately respect them a little bit more, you take them more seriously, and I think long term, it doesn't taint the brand that they're representing as well.
Yes. And I just want to jump in here because PR agents and media and journalists need each other both as much.
Yes, that's
and
what
they both need each other, but at different times.
At different times.
That's the problem.
The key thing, though, for me is the relationships. I mean, you as a PR agent, you have to have very strong relationships with the media that are in the industry that your clients operates in. And it becomes a one-on-one thing because you must admit the lines are blurred.
I fundamentally disagree.
The lines are really blurred because when you've got the relationship, you can say to the journalist, okay, this is the story, but can we work around it this way?
No. red rag to a very angry bull. And not a bull duster. Okay, so here's a situation where you talk about access, you talk about relationships. That's one aspect of everyday humdrum media, all of that sort of stuff. I remember when the Barclays guys came to South Africa and they had just bought Absa. This is 2005. More than one of that team of Barclays executives came and said, if you don't tell my version of events, I'm not going to be, you won't get to interview me again. I was a lot younger, a lot more hair back then, and I was like, okay then. Right, and you kind of get intimidated into that.
And if someone says, we prefer not, if you don't touch on that story.
Come on, give it to me. Come on, give me that line. So access, yes, it's convenient and useful. It is in the PR company's best interest that their client is represented.
Sure.
From a media perspective, however, don't give me access. I will still get a story. I promise you that. Look at Noseweek, probably one of the most incisive, quite difficult to muddle through sometimes. Don't tell me that they get access to the main protagonists in the story. There are 1,000 good sources for any good story. The story of access is in the PR company's best interests. It's not necessarily in the interests of good journalism, and it's certainly not necessarily in the interests of a media consuming public. And I think that is where the lines cannot ever be blurred. So I'm drawing a firm line just there.
I have to agree with Bruce there. I don't agree that the lines should be blurred. I think that's stepping into unethical territory. I think as long as a journalist realizes, I agree with you that a good working relationship between a journalist and a PR can be to both parties' benefit. I think from the journalist perspective, the trick is to always maintain an arm's length, to always remember that person's not your friend, that person is a professional acquaintance, and you can have a healthy working professional relationship, but the minute lines get blurred, I think you're both in dangerous waters.
But that's exactly what I'm saying from a PR perspective as well, is that I've got this relationship with you that works, but there's some things that I can reveal to you, and there are certain things that I cannot. But we've got a working relationship where you get what you're looking for, and I also get what I need to deliver for my clients.
It's a fundamental, it's such an interesting dichotomy though, and a different worldview.
Sure.
And public relations is, I've got something to give you, and my worldview is, I'm trying to find something out that you're not prepared to tell me. And I think it's perfectly healthy. I really do think it's perfectly healthy. And I quote somebody who's very senior in the world of investor relations, a man called Rob Pinker, who is a senior executive at Brunswick. It's a worldwide relationship, investor relations company. And his view is, well, reputation matters, as you were talking about, and it is his responsibility to ensure that his client's reputation is guarded and protected. My job is, if there is a reputation question that needs to be investigated, is to uncover that reputation issue and to expose that reputation issue. Lebel's job, Rob's job, and other people in that particular industry then need to backpedal as fast as they possibly can to preserve that reputation.
I'm interested in putting Lebel on the spot here.
Oh,
sorry to do that, but I would like your opinion on the FNB advert campaign that got pulled. Well, parts of it got pulled.
Yeah.
As a professional PR person, if you were advising FNB if you had seen that advert before it had been aired to the public, what would your advice have been?
I would have advised them that they were charting on very dangerous territory, that from previous cases we've seen how the ANC reacts to criticism, that if we do go ahead with it, we are going ahead knowing that we will be attacked, and we would have to work on a crisis management plan on how we would respond once this ad goes out.
And that's perhaps what they did.
And that's probably what they did. They did it knowing that they had a plan on how they would respond once it's gone out. They probably had their reasons. They probably wanted the publicity. They probably had their own reasons on why they wanted this ad to go out. I don't think that it was a stupid, if I can call it stupid, mistake for them to go out.
Didn't they blunder?
I think it was planned.
The ad itself is fairly benign. The ad itself isn't particularly offensive as it stands. The 2-minute, if anything that's offensive, it was quite boring. But it was all the clips around it, and that seemed to be far more divisive. And that was the misstep and the misjudgment in that particular matter.
Let's look at issues around client relations and when it is the right time to ditch a client or fire a client and step away. What's your experience in that?
My belief is clients bring you on because you're an expert. You work with the media, you understand the media, but you also represent their business, which means you have to know their business very well and be able to match their business objectives with what they want to put into the media. But they have to be able to take your advice. Because whatever advice you give them is because you know better in terms of how media works.
But they know their company better.
But they know their company
and
better.
What their strategy
and
is.
What their strategy is. But the strategy might be jeopardizing to their reputation.
I love the bit best when they ignore your advice. Generally, that works so much better for us.
Because it works against them.
Exactly.
It works but they bring you on as an expert, as a consultant, so that you can give them advice on how they can put themselves across better. And if they don't listen to that, then what's your role?
I do think you hit on an important point. Good PRs know how the media works.
Yeah.
And the strange thing is, as a journalist, you often run into PR people who have no clue how the media works. And you certainly run into business people who have even less of a clue. True. So there is merit in good PR, I think.
I think, a lot of good PRs are actually ex-journalists. That's why they know how the world of media works so well.
But that transition is difficult. That transition, I think, is very difficult because you're cut from a particular cloth and you have to be something of a chameleon to be able to make that transition. I think it can be a tough transition. Not everybody who goes from the light to the dark succeeds.
Oh, no.
To the dark side.
To the dark
I told
side.
you, that's 3 journalists.
This
is bound to happen. Give us your view on what took place, what takes place when journalists become a little bit too close to the subjects, and you touched on this as well, Bruce, because that is something that PR people have to manage. Of course, you know, not having the CEO's number on the end of your phone and being able to be too close to them. Perhaps you buy into their story too much and you don't become objective.
I think. What do you mean, when journalists get too close to the story?
Yeah, I mean, as a PR agent, is that something that you have to manage when journalists become too close to either the CEO or the company or representatives at the company whose information or who are your clients, basically?
Well, I generally do not discourage relationships between the client and journalists, but it also depends on who the client is and how well versed and informed they are about how media works. I mean, they know that journalists are not their friends. I mean, that's the one thing that we always tell them. You can have a drink with them, but they're not your best friend. So you always have to be guarded about that relationship and how that relationship works.
How have you managed that, Bruce?
I think you can have perfectly acceptable, perfectly good working relationships with people who understand your needs, you understand their needs, you understand when you're being spun a line, and it is then your job to work around that particular individual. If I know that I'm onto a good story, and the person who thinks they have a good relationship with me is the subject of that particular story, the public interest outweighs the personal relationship. I'm terribly sorry, that is the consequence of that. So you're absolutely...
That's why they have to be guarded.
You have to, and look, you are a public figure, you have got a public image and a public reputation. You besmirch that reputation at your own risk. If you choose to besmirch your reputation, either through lying, being corrupt, or being caught with your trousers down at an inopportune moment, I'm afraid that you are, in the public eye, you are subject to public scrutiny, and it is then the role of a responsible media to deal with that story in a matter that is in the, what we perceive anyway, to be in the best public interest. Then Lebel comes along, of course, and needs to, because she's paid a lot of money to do it, to best protect the image of her client. Well, you see, he didn't really have his trousers down. He just wasn't wearing a belt that morning, or whatever the excuse might be. Under that sort of example.
Very good.
Yeah. You'd make a great PR.
I think I might. Can I just, before we go, Sam, because you always rush me like this. The guy who's credited with being the father of modern-day public relations was a nephew of Sigmund Freud. His name was Edward Bernays, and he wrote a book in 1928 called Propaganda, and he'd been part of the Woodrow Wilson regime in World War I and understood the power of propaganda. He then turned that into public relations. This was the genesis of modern public relations. And he basically just said, it's a long quote, but I'm just going to give you one little bit out of it. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind.
It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind.
1928, he was a wise guy, Mr. Bernays.
There we
That's
go.
why they named
Sigmund
it
Freud's
Sauce after him.
nephew.
Absolutely.